Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Consciousness Hour. Today's going to be a particularly fascinating show because, as is always the case when our guest today, Professor Rob Gandy, and I get chatting, we go off on the most amazing tangents and great areas of interest. Rob is based up on Wirral in Merseyside, where I originally am from. And in fact, Rob and I we had a curious situation whereby Rob was living no more than probably around about 200 or 300 yards from where I lived for 6 years, and we never knew of each other's existence, which is very, very sad, particularly because I've admired the writings of Professor Gandy for many, many years, because I have been a follower of this incredible magazine since virtually it started. And over the years, I'd always spot these particular articles written about ghost hauntings and time slips and various other things based on the Wirral area and in the northwest of England. And I thought, who is this guy that's writing all this fascinating stuff? Little was I to know that, as I say, he was round the corner from me. And funnily enough, a few years ago, I met up with the founding editor of 14 Times, Bob Rickard. And we had a lovely couple of meetings when I was working at the National Gallery in London. And we discussed various mutual people we knew about in mutual circles. And of course, Rob came up, even though I didn't make the link at the time, which is one of these things. And I've been wanting to get him on the show here for some time because his work and research is extraordinary. And his articles are extraordinary. So without further ado, welcome to Consciousness Hour, Rob.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I live up to that introduction. It's very kind of you to say the things that you said.
No, your articles are wonderful. I mean, I particularly enjoyed your article in the recent edition. And of course, in it, CJ Romer is mentioned in your article, who has been a previous guest on this show as well.
Yeah, CJ is good fun, yeah.
He's wonderful. He's wonderful. What a sense of humor that guy has. Absolutely incredible.
Was he wearing a hat?
He was. You know, absolutely incredible. Because I'm doing the ASAP event at Bath University later on this year as well, so we'll be meeting up with him again there. So very much a billion-dollar question initially is, how on earth did you get into the things you're interested in? You know, as an academic and everything else.
Hang on, no, I'm not an academic. I suppose I should explain what I am. I'm a statistician by trade, a health statistician. I've worked most of my career in the NHS or around it as a management consultant. When I worked in Leicester, 2 days a week, I was seconded to the University Department of Community Medicine, which would be public health by today's standards. And there I was encouraged to get involved in research. And there were great people there. They really enthused you and got you. And it's a bit of a bug when you do some research and then you write a paper and it gets published and you go, wow, I mean, you know, the euphoria lasts for at least 10 seconds and then you come down. And all through my career, I've taken the view that if you do something that is comparatively innovative, then that might be useful to other people, either in what they do or what they're interested in, then you write it up and you disseminate it either through a proper journal or maybe through a magazine, like an accountancy professionals magazine or something like that, which isn't high standing from a journal, but you get to the people, you get to the target audience. And when I was doing management consultancy, I got involved with Liverpool John Moores University as an honorary research associate, where I did work on their projects and they did work on my projects, which was a good relationship. And then, where are we talking about? 2011, with having got a PhD at the tender age of about 57. They asked me if I would be a visiting professor, which is just an honorary position. And so I've never taught anybody other than a few stats sessions back in Leicester. Now, I don't consider myself to be an academic, but I I suppose I consider myself to be more of a researcher. Sorry, I've dragged on a bit there, haven't I?
Well, I think that's just very honourable of you, because you could easily, sort of play on that. But anyway, so how did you become involved in the magical, the mystical, the parapsychological? What was it that stimulated your interest?
Well, I'm a great believer that a lot of it is to do with family, and when I was young, family talked about strange things that sometimes went on. And when I was 10, my friend Nikki and I pored over what was a illustrated comic magazine of A Christmas Carol, and we converted that. I was Bob Cratchit, he was Scrooge, into a play that we were doing in our class in Springdale School in Wolverhampton. And then you just start talking about it. Now I got interested in, you read Dracula and you meet, when you're a teenager, you're immediately seeing vampires around every corner and werewolves. I mean, you're talking about the 1960s, the heyday of Oliver Reed and Hammer horror and things like that. So yeah, I've always had an interest, but in terms of writing articles and so on and so forth, I did one or two things for Fortune Times way back, but I'd written a thing about the Old Man of Halsell Moss, as I called it, which is a Phantom Hitchhiker story, which I came across by accident because it happened to a colleague at work, and we're talking about urban legends, Phantom Hitchhiker, and they said, well, actually, that's happened to me. And I'm, oh, really? And I'm a great believer that if you don't write these things down and publish them, then they'll just evaporate into the ether. And what you need, which I'm a great believer in, is evidence. And getting the data out there. This is me being a statistician, I suppose. And so I wrote that up. And then I suppose things took off more around 2015, to be specific, because I realized that it was, first of all, I'd retired. Other than doing part-time bits and bobs, doing research with a business school. And I realized that it was coming up to 50 years since my colleague had had this experience on Halsell Moss. And I thought, oh, I wonder if anybody else had that sort of experience. And so I thought, well, how do you try and find out? Well, you can't go around knocking on people's doors, and saying, excuse me, but who had a strange experience? You'd soon get arrested. So I hit on the idea of actually going through the local freebie newspaper. And the people in the Champion were kind enough to put a piece whereby it does help to be able to put, Dr. Rob Gandy or Professor Rob Gandy, because it gives you some credence rather than, Fred Bloggs, the local parapsychologist or something like that. And I just said, without giving too much details, because some people just feed it back to you, something happened on Halsell Moss. Has anybody else experienced it? And I thought if I could get another couple of stories, then great. I got 8 replies, all good stories, some of them quite mind-boggling. And then I thought, well, because I used to be the end-of-life lead for commissioning lead for Liverpool Primary Care Trust on an acting basis for about 18 months. So I've got a close affinity with the hospices and so on. And I decided to give some feedback to the people of that area by doing a talk to raise money for the local Queen's Court charity hospice. And when I went and gave the talk in Birkdale, what I couldn't believe was that I was approached before the session by somebody who'd sat on a story about how he'd nearly wrecked his E-type Jag, swerving to avoid a farmer in the middle of the road. It turned out to be a Phantom Hitchhiker type phenomenon. And when I finished giving my talk, there was a queue of people with their own stories. And it's just taken off from there, and you write those things, and then people get in touch with you. And I hypothesize, is it something to do with landscape? Because it's flat and the mists come down, and it plays tricks with your perceptions, perspectives and that. and I wondered if anything might have happened over in the fens. And that's when I came across the Ruskington Horror, which started off as like 1 or 2 articles and ended up as 9. Because people get in touch and they're aware of it. And sometimes these pieces where you make a request sit on the internet indefinitely, and somebody who's had an experience goes, I wonder if anybody's had anything, and they Google and then they see my name, which is like sitting there infinitely. And that's when somebody got in touch from Scunthorpe and talked about the Scotter Road spectre, as it was called, a 14-foot high monk walking down the middle of the road in the rain. I mean, some of these stories are great, and some of them I cannot explain. And I adopt a fairly open-minded but skeptical approach to these things. So it's just sort of like rambled on from there, I suppose.
Well, one of the things that, when you wrote that article on the Russington Horror, I thought that was quite fascinating, an excellent article, and it really stimulated a lot of thoughts in my mind about what is taking place when these supposed, it's a mixture, isn't it, of urban legend together with actual experiences. And of course, when you're in the position, you can go back to the person who experienced it, rather than, I heard my great granddad met somebody once who actually had this experience. You're going back to the source material.
I restrict my stories to first-hand and second-hand, no more than that. Second-hand, I mean, when somebody says, this is what happened to my dad, and he told me about it, directly, and this is what happened to him, and I believe I'll quote that. But once it gets to my friend told me about what happened to his dad, then I don't involve that.
Do you have?
It's a shame, because there was one about a cavalier on horseback floating across a lane in the middle of Halsall Moss, so I couldn't think of that.
So do you have, over the years, have you developed a kind of an instinct as to whether somebody is doing it for notoriety or for fame or whatever, and somebody who's speaking to you genuinely? Do you sense that or not?
To a degree. I like at the recent Weird Weekend North, the final speaker, David Adams, who I'd written an article about him under a pseudonym about his personal experiences. And he said that he was like being interrogated by the CIA with me. I do it in a friendly way, but when people give me their story, I take the details that they give me, and then I try and write it into a narrative as though it's a story that is actually happening. And then I feed it back to them, and I will not, as it were, go for publication or include it in an article until they are 100% happy with it. So you to and fro, and of course, from the initial information that you're given, you absorb it, and then you think, oh, hang on, was the car radio on? What was the weather like? He's not mentioned the weather, and what time of day was it? So you start to piece it together. And I think I'm fortunate in that I think rarely, if ever, have I come across anybody that I think is trying to, waggle my chain, as it were. And I always go by how sincere the people sound. I mean, sometimes it's over the phone, sometimes it's the way that they write their emails or so on. But the overwhelming, not sensation, but feeling that I get from the people is that they're just so relieved to get somebody who is a sympathetic ear. And they sat, I mean, the guy, I say about the E-Type Jag, that happened 40 years ago.
Can you tell the story? Can you give the background?
Oh, that one?
Yeah.
There was a guy called John who was, for the benefit of people who aren't familiar with the area, Halsall Moss is flat farmland with lanes going across it, some of them quite straight. It's reclaimed, historically, ancient wise, it's reclaimed sea land. for farming, and sometimes the actual roads are above the level of the farmland surrounding it. And so we're going back to 1970s, and he got an E-Type Jag, which is a great car, you know, and he was hammering it down whichever lane it was. And there, he was doing about 60, I think it was the evening, and there in front of him, dressed in, well, it was an old farmer, an old farmer dressed in older farming type attire, which he said would possibly be more late 19th century, early 20th century garb. So his instinct was to slam on the brakes and steer away. The guy didn't move, and the E-Type then went right out about 20 yards through the air, landing in the field. And normally that sort of thing, for that sort of car, with the way the chassis is and all that, it should have just fallen apart, but it didn't. And he turned around and he looked, and there was no sign of anybody at all. So he basically found his way back onto the road, looked around, no sign of the farmer or what have you. And eventually the ambulance came and took him to the local Southport hospital, where he was checked over. Next day he goes back to the to where his car is, and he gave me photos of it. He'd taken all photos of that, and it was quite a way away from the road, and quite a drop. And so he went. There was only one house nearby, and he went up to them and said, "Well, thanks very much for calling the ambulance for me, given what had happened." And they said, "We didn't call the ambulance." And he can't explain that. And then he got whoever it was, lorry or whatever, to collect the car and get it back on the road, and he was driving it after. But he'd never gone and told anybody about it until he saw that I was going to be giving this talk about phantom hitchhikers on House of Moss.
It's intriguing, isn't it? Because when I discover this, whenever I do presentations or talks, it is inevitable at the end. The best part, most enjoyable thing when you do talks is when the audience, you get feedback from the audience. Mm-hmm. And it's something you said before when we were chatting before we came live, that so many people do have these experiences, but they're very nervous about talking about them. And it's only when they feel secure in the environment that the person they're talking to is at least willing to listen rather than ridicule, that you get all the information out of them. And you genuinely, as you rightly said, you just sense that this person, it's almost getting it off their chest. This did happen to me. And the wonderful series of articles you have in 14 Times, It Happened to Me, are so important because it allows people like you and I to make linkages, because we read a great deal about these things and talk to a lot of people. We're in the position of being able to see the patterns and to think, well, this is interesting because it echoes other experiences that people have.
Well, this is me being a statistician, you see. It's just part of my nature. I look for patterns.
Well, it is. You look for causation and correlation, and you look for the linkages, and you think, well, there's got to be something underlying this. It's almost like the Jungian the acausal principle of synchronicity. The idea that how many, and of course we have, don't we? The law of large numbers. The Richard Wiseman article. The idea that you can disprove anything by just using the law of large numbers. But just because you're applying that doesn't necessarily mean that you've disproven it. All you've said is that I might be able to explain it statistically. And for me, these things are of extraordinary importance, and your work to me is of profound importance because you're actually doing the vox pop. You're going out there and you're talking to experiences, and they're giving a social commentary of what's going on.
I did it for my own interest. I wondered how many testimonies, for want of a better word, as a collective, I got, and it's over 160.
Right.
First and second hand, mainly first hand testimonies of people having experiences from sensing malignant nuns on the stairway to, as I say, the little girl in the nightdress outside the mental hospital outside Lincoln, which I cannot explain for the life of me.
Go on. So,
oh, right, okay. It was early one, I think it was either a Saturday or a Sunday morning, and there was this couple with their daughter who were driving out of Lincoln at about, I don't know, 7:30, 8 o'clock. And the daughter was going to be in some gymnastics competition, however many miles away. This is why they were in the car. As they drove past the mental health hospital, which was closed, which I can't remember the name without looking it up, so please forgive me. They saw, standing by the railings on the left, a young girl, probably about 7 years of age, in a nightdress. And they all three saw her. And she looked a bit quite transparent. And they thought this was odd, but they carried on driving at about 30 miles an hour. But what then really threw them was that as they came alongside or close to the little girl, she then kind of switched and moved along the pavement as though she was floating just ahead of them. And they likened it to, it wasn't as though she was just there floating along. They said it was like a series of individual images. And they followed her for about, I think about half a mile, and she disappeared. Now, what I was so pleased about when I was dealing with the father was that he said that afterwards they decided that they would independently write down what they had seen and then compare notes, and all their notes were exactly spot on, except for the degree of whether the girl had slightly darker hair or slightly lighter hair, minor details. Now, that you've got a multiple witness situation of something that I've never heard of, that sort of phenomena at all before. A bit mind-blowing, I found it.
These are the ones that really intrigue me, the ones that are non-standard, the ones that give you the idea of how the visuals are working.
Yeah.
And I find it very intriguing. You're thinking about kind of a series of almost static images moving together to give the impression of movement. And I've written extensively about the work of people, about how the visual systems work. And some of the original theories of people like Julian Barber, and the idea that, sort of time is in slices and we actually move through the slices. Again, within quantum physics, it's the idea of Minkowskian time. And
my A-level physics in the shade.
Right. So you'll understand about the concept of Minkowski and Minkowski's ideas of time. Now, to me, obviously, a group of people all seeing the same thing. The only excuse you can come to here, well, you can give two, can't you? You can turn around and say it's some form of collective hallucination. Now, how collective
hallucination is?
Yeah, exactly. Nobody knows what a hallucination is. And, the fallback position is that somehow these people telepathically have linked themselves together to see something that's not there. Nonsensical. The argument for me, I always use the argument, empiricism is from experience. It's empirical. Yeah. So therefore, if a group of people see it, we have to deal with it or assume they're all collectively lying. And that's the only alternatives we have. Yeah. And it's bad science to not look at these things. Just because your science cannot explain it using your present scientific paradigm suggests that your present scientific paradigm has errors in it, in which case you have to accommodate what you're witnessing. And, they love this term, don't they? The plural of anecdote is not proof. Well, no, it's not. But if there's enough anecdotal evidence, in a court of law. If 4 people saw something in a court of law, somebody could be convicted of murder for that, you know?
Oh, yeah. But then you're coming on to the memories, which was what we're supposed to be talking
What
about.
we're going to be talking about, yes.
Yeah, because the memories of those 4 people who witnessed the murder that you were just describing would probably all have slightly different memories of what they saw. Some of them might contradict each other. And there's been recent research, which I caught sight of, but didn't read more than the abstract, which is that even short-term memory is fallible, partly influenced by what you expect rather than necessarily what you see. In that you see something happen, and then in the seconds afterwards, you're translating it partly by how what you would have expected to have been there. So that that's memory is such a fragile thing, but such an important thing at the same time.
Well, we are, because we are pattern-seeking creatures. So we seek out patterns. And, it's the whole argument of attention, that famous experiment of gorillas in our midst, whereby you are told to look at one thing and you completely miss what's going on. And we know misdirection is the central pole the illusionists use all the time. Yeah. And of course, as you rightly say, it seems that memory, as soon as we've perceived something, the accretions we put onto that, our expectations of what we're going to see, suddenly color it extraordinarily. And of course, one of the things that I know that you've done a recent lecture on, which is the perfect segue into that now, is the whole Mandela effect, the whole idea of false memories, or memories that we believe we experienced that we didn't. And would you like to talk about that a little bit now? Because your talk on that was quite extraordinary.
Well, will everybody know what we mean by the Mandela effect?
No, please explain. Yes, please.
I'm not going to claim to be an expert. There's a lady, a researcher, I'm just trying to look up her name, Fiona Broome, in America, who many years ago in the 1980s at the conference, and came up and mentioned that in conversation that people thought that they remembered Nelson Mandela of actually dying while he was in prison. And they could remember TV programs and shots of the funeral and so on and so forth. Well, of course, he hadn't died. And well, maybe these people weren't into rugby union and seeing him wearing a South Africa shirt and presenting the World Cup to South Africa at the time. And because there were so many people within the group who also shared that experience, but she knew it was wrong. She decided to do various research on this, and there's a website about it with lots of purported examples of this sort of phenomenon. And because it's got a nice name, famous guy, a really, really good guy, it gets quoted quite a lot by people. I have to confess that I'm quite skeptical about it, because so many of the examples that are given, I don't think that they are that extraordinary. I mean, whether it was Looney Tunes or Looney Tunes. Now, it's very easy to get mixed up. I mean, I mentioned to you, which was at the beginning of one of my presentations, which I gave when I talked about this at the Lapis conference in Blackpool, or Little Sedans, I should say, just before COVID, where I'd agreed to give a talk about it. And I said, what you must do is dig out Perry Como's, what was the song I was going?
Memories are made of this.
Memories are made of this. Yeah. To the people who were Janet and who was organised, they said, "Oh yeah, no problem, all that." And then I got the message back saying, and the reason why I wanted to do that was that I wanted a nice jaunty intro to get people, thinking, oh, this is a nice guy, as you do when you're doing a talk. Because memories are made of this, Perry Como. Whenever I hear Perry Como, I always think of my Auntie Jo, because she was the biggest fan. And every time he was on the radio, she'd be singing along to him. And I just thought I'd do that as an example. And the message came back, we can't find Memories of Memories by Perry Como. I thought, don't be so silly. It's by Dean Martin. I said, yeah, but Perry Como must have sung it as well. No, he didn't. And what it was, I would have sworn blind, and I could imagine Perry Como singing it, but the song that I was thinking about was Magic Moments. Memories we've been sharing. And I think you said that you made the same thing.
I did exactly, when you mentioned this, I did exactly the same, because my father was a huge fan of Perry Como. And I would have sworn, when I didn't see that it was the wrong song, I did exactly the same association you did. Exactly the same.
Yeah. So I realized that, how delicate, if that's the right word, memories can be. And so I went through a whole range of things, which some of us will come on to. But when it came to the examples that were being quoted about the Mandela effect, people saying that they were surprised when they saw David So on the television because they were sure he was dead. And the same with Ernest Borgnine. Well, the number of times in my life where I've sat with me mum and dad or my wife, and somebody comes on the telly and they go, I thought he was dead. It's Engelbert, at random, Engelbert Humperdinck. Now, as far as I know, he's still alive, but some people might think he's dead because, he's retired a long time ago. If he turns up, I honestly don't know whether he's alive or dead. I presume that he is. I hope he is. But, just because you sometimes don't see somebody that you like from, historically you might have said, oh, he was in a lot of films, and then you don't see them. You assume that, either they're retired or they're dead or something like that. So I don't see that as necessarily being a phenomenon, other than it is something that people do. It's just one of those things that happens to memories.
It reminds me of memory again. It reminds me of that wonderful film. I think it was Escape from New York. I think it was, when the central character, Kurt Russell, I can't remember, it was somebody Pliskin, I think, was the character. And one of the running jokes all through the film was every time he met somebody, they'd say, "Oh, so-and-so, I thought you were dead." And it's quite amusing in its way. But I think you're quite right. When you look at research into memory and how it's very capricious, and it's very dependent upon our values and everything else as well. But one of the citing examples that I'm quite dismissive of the Mandela effect, because I think people pull these things together and it takes a life on of its own. But there was one of them that I really do have a problem with. And that's the one of the James Bond character, Jaws. And do you know the sequence? Do you know this one? So let's test you. Do you know about the Mandela effect on Jaws?
I can't remember it. I'll be
Great.
honest.
If you can't, then do you remember at the end of the movie, there's a girl called Dolly, and he falls in love with her.
Jaws was in 2 movies.
All right. Well, whichever one it was, I don't know which one it was he was in, because I'm not a James Bond fan.
Yeah.
But there's a sequence whereby he, as we know, he had metal teeth or something. Yeah. And this young girl comes over to him and something else, and she smiles at him. And she has metal teeth, or she has something in her mouth, which makes him fall in love with her because he shares something with her. And they become happy ever after kind of thing. But apparently, that's not what happened. She didn't have any braces on her teeth. And I cannot believe that, because I'm sure that's what I remember. And that's what a lot of people remember.
I don't remember that at all, I'll be honest.
Okay, because that's one of the main ones. And the other one I really like, and I think this is, again, is expectation rather than anything, and proof of the contrary. The man on the Monopoly box, you know, the Monopoly character, does he have a monocle?
Oh, I can't remember.
Okay.
He either does or he doesn't. You know.
Yeah, because I could swear he did, but he doesn't. And
Yeah.
is it again because we assume that kind of character will have a monocle?
Yeah.
So it's again us projecting our expectations onto the external world. Or could it be something even stranger? Could it be that in many ways we collapse the wave function of our expectations and we populate the environment with our expectations, rather like we do in dream worlds? And the idea that because you expect something to look like that, almost your history is backpopulated with that expectation in one way or another. And it's a very intriguing area. But moving on then, so in terms of some of the examples you came across in terms of the Mandela effect, have you got any others that you find intriguing or interesting?
Well, I mean, some of them are like the number of states in the USA. There's 50, you know, but apparently some people think 51 or 52. I mean,
that's not strange, is it? That's just,
you know,
yeah.
And does Forrest Gump say, A, life was like a box of chocolates, or B, life is like a box of chocolates?
Yeah.
We'll start it for 10.
I think it was life is like a box of chocolates, I think. But again, I've never seen the film.
It was apparently. And it was Snow White, you know, is it mirror, mirror on the wall? No, it's magic mirror on the wall.
Now that I didn't know. That's interesting.
Yeah, but
again, it's a transcription, isn't it? And it's you know, as I said before, you know, because we are such pattern-seeking creatures that we put things, we populate things that aren't there.
But it's not necessarily just that. It's possibly sometimes because we hear people think they're quoting.
Yes.
And we are quoting their quotation.
Yes.
So the number of times that you've heard somebody say mirror, mirror on the wall.
Yeah.
Rather than actually quoting the film, you're probably quoting more likely the people quoting the film or think they're quoting the film.
Well, I think this is the classic example of, isn't it, how we should apply Occam's razor here. How we should apply the more simple explanation is more likely to be the explanation. Now, we can have the explanation, either people's memories are not working, or when they switched on the Large Hadron Collider, we changed the universe and the universe switched into another. Think it's more likely that your memory is not quite working correctly. So it is so important that we apply Occam's razor. And it was something that Marcello Trui, the very famous, I think he was Danish, although he sounds Italian, but I think he was Danish skeptic, turned around and said that, you know, that extraordinary experiences need extraordinary proofs. You know, it's if I turn around and I say I saw a black taxi drive down in front of my house, well, you know, you're not going to expect proof for that. Whereas if I said a pink elephant with a clown sitting on its trunk went past, then you'd say, well, okay, fine. You know, what evidence have you got for that? Because that's how it works. But in many ways, a lot of these phenomenon, people don't do that. It's just so stories, isn't it? It gets confabulated, it gets exaggerated in different ways. Because one of the biggest disappointments of my research over many years when I've been writing my books is that I'll find something that people quote all the time, and you'll find it online and everything else. I go back to the original research papers, or I go back to the original thing, and it falls apart, doesn't it? Suddenly it didn't quite happen like that. And it never happened like that. It's what people believe.
The quotation's often out of context.
Yes. And it's so important as researchers into this field that we always bear that in mind. Right. And we have to, because people love the strange and the extraordinary, because we live in a mundane world, don't we? Lots of the time.
We do, but as we were chatting before, I had a very strange experience. Well, not me personally, although it happened to me. Last year, I speak regularly at Weird Weekend North near Warrington, always in April. And of course, we had postponements and gaps because of COVID, unfortunately. So where are we? 2022. So we'd missed 2 years. And then last year I was giving a talk about the Aintree spectres, which just outside Aintree, near the racecourse, but actually in a field just the other side of the village. Strange people dressed very much like the Ku Klux Klan seem to go wandering around with brandishing torches in the middle of the night. All very strange. It doesn't happen anymore. Well, I've not been told of any, but this happened over about 30 or 40 years. And it was pretty scary for some of the witnesses that I was involved with. So I gave this talk, I'd prepared it, and I was the first on at Weird Weekend North 2022. And I gave this talk. It was the first time I'd ever done it, although the article had been published in Fortean Times. As soon as I finished, the lady from the front row came over to me and said, why had I repeated my talk about the Aintree spectres, including the same anecdotes and joking asides? And I said, this is the first time I've ever done it. And she looked rather stunned then. And she said, oh, sometimes this sort of thing does happen to me. Now, I had to clear up because the next person was going to come on and give their talk. I said, I'll catch you up at the next break. So I did, and she was with her daughter. And I said, so what's all this about? And they said, well, while they were outside, they were talking, and one of the other people in the audience said that they'd seen me do it as well. And I said, no. So they pointed me out. Pointed the gentleman out to me, and I went over to him and said, excuse me, but those ladies have said that you've seen me give that talk before. And he said, yeah, but he admitted more a sense of deja vu with it. And I thought, this is all a bit weird. So at one of the breaks, when I had to give a talk about the availability of T-shirts, as you do, I said, well, 2 people think that they've seen me give my talk before, but I haven't. So if there's anybody else out there who thinks that they've seen me do it before, please let me know. And a third person came up to me and said, yeah, I've seen you do it before. And I can't explain it. I mean, nothing to me, I didn't experience anything other than 3 different people at the same event saying that they've seen me do the presentation before.
That is extraordinary, but strangely enough, very, very similar to a previous guest on this podcast, Susan Laybourne. And Susan once explained to me that she was in an audience. There was some lecture going on, and she was in the audience, and there was a lady sitting next to her. And she said, oh, you're Susan Laybourne, the famous medium, aren't you? And Susan said, yes, she was. And the lady said, and she turned around to her and she said, do you know, I really enjoyed your book. And Susan said, what book? And she said, you know, the book you wrote. And she described some of the details of the book that Susan had written.
Yeah.
And Susan turned around and she said, I haven't written that book. She said, I've been working on it for many, many years, and it's still on my computer. It's never been published. I don't talk about it to anybody. And this woman was convinced that she'd read her book. Right. And just like yours there, you know, it's as if there's these kind of interlocking, I know it's sort of pseudoscience, and it is. Well, to a degree it is, but, you know, Everett's many worlds interpretation would say that there are parallel universes. And, you know, and the quantum physics doesn't support it, but the actual theoretical part of it does. So the idea is, you know, could there be overlaps between overlapping universes where slightly different futures or different pasts have occurred, and they join together in a node point, and then they go away again? But for a split second, your brain is accessing information from another timeline that is a timeline of yours where an alternate thing happened. Because there's no other explanation for that, is there? These people genuinely believed that they'd seen your talk before.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that one of the things that it threw up in my mind was whether COVID had some kind of effect. I mean, I think that everybody who's gone through the COVID pandemic, there's 2 years of your life that you're not going to get back. And I find that when I try and think of having seen friends, maybe you give them a phone call and say, let's, why don't you come and stay with us? It's as if you haven't seen them for about 9 months. But then when you look at your diary, it's because you haven't seen them for about 2.5 years.
Yeah.
And I've got this feeling, no empirical evidence, but I believe that somehow, not COVID itself, but like the lockdown experience that many people have had, and the isolation in many, associated with it, must have had, some strange effects in some cases. I mean, that's, I don't know if anybody's researched that or whatever, maybe it's something for fruitful research, but this was I was the first speaker at the first weird weekend after, COVID had put the mockers on things for 2 years. And maybe it's just coincidence, but very, very strange on that.
It is, and the whole point you're saying, discussing earlier on about memory, and it always intrigues me, the concept of memory, where memories are stored, how they are processed, and of course nobody knows how memories are stored. In fact, there was the famous example, I think it was Carl Lashley, the American psychologist, and he did a series of experiments with rats whereby they taught rats to do certain things and go around mazes, and they cut sections of the brains out, and the rats still remembered how to go around the mazes. So it seems, and of course one could argue from that, and as Carl Lashley argued, after all these years of experience of his research, he came to the conclusion that memory is probably all over the brain. It's not located in any one location.
Well, yeah, I tend to be more influenced by the argument that of cellular memory.
Yes.
Which is, I'm looking at the time, we probably haven't got the time to go into.
No, but very much, because I noticed that both of you, for instance, both you and I in talks have discussed the work of Tam Shomrat and his other guys, where they cut the heads off the worms, and the worms regrow the brains. Yeah. And the memories continue because they trained them, didn't they, to go to meat in a certain way. Yeah. Now, this means effectively that the brain does not, the brain is a receiver of information rather than it is a producer of information. Yeah. And I think this was, and who was the American researcher? You cited an American researcher whose name escapes me that I've written about.
His name was James McConnell.
And McConnell's work. Now, McConnell, as you said, he was an interesting looking character. I love in your talk where you turn around about McConnell and say that he was a shy kind of character, whereas in fact he looked incredibly flamboyant and not the least bit retiring. That quite amused me.
I might have been being ironic at that point.
Yeah. McConnell's work was indeed fascinating. And again, wasn't it, he taught things and he fed them to other things, and then the other things remembered, having as if the cells. But we know, for instance, the amount of times I've come across, and I'll be going to be researching this more for my new book, is the idea when individuals have heart transplants and their personality changes.
Oh, yes. I mean, there's lots of wonderful examples, but I mean, the one example on that, which I'll quote here, which is from Paul Pearsall's book on it. He was giving a talk and in Houston and about this sort of issue, and he said, and this lady, this doctor in the audience said, I have a patient, an 8-year-old little girl who received the heart of a murdered 10-year-old girl. Her mother brought her to me when she started screaming at night about her dreams of the man who had murdered her donor. She said her daughter knew who it was. After several sessions, I just could not deny the reality of what this child was telling me. Her mother and I finally decided to call the police, and using the descriptions from the little girl, they found the murderer. He was easily convicted with evidence my patient provided. The time, the weapon, the place, the clothes he wore, what the little girl he killed said to him, everything the little heart transplant recipient recorded was completely accurate.
That is extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think Purcell's work is really intriguing.
It's an excellent book, and it's definitely worth reading if you're interested in this sort of thing.
Because, you know, what does this tell us again? It tells us that, again, we're misunderstanding how nature works. We're misunderstanding how, at the molecular level, and that it works. Information seems to transfer itself in ways that we're not too sure understanding. I mean, DNA has a coding. The codons within DNA can carry information.
Yeah.
And it just seems that we're missing a trick here. We need to listen to these stories and not put them down as stories, but say, this is telling us something.
Well, maybe DNA is a kind of like wavelength that, you know, is tuned into.
Yeah.
It's still, you know, the heart is still tuned into the, I don't know, the soul or whatever. I mean,
well, it is, isn't it? It's epigenetics, and it's, you know, for, you know, giving the example of Rupert Sheldrake's work in morphic resonance, you know, clearly there is something going on here that we are misunderstanding, because I always use the analogy, you know, of the Thomas Kuhn argument, you know, the idea of the theory of scientific revolutions, and that every scientific paradigm will believe that it has the complete answers, but there will be small things within that paradigm that cannot be answered, and it's those small things that will be which will generate the new paradigm. And I genuinely believe that researchers like you and people that are going out there talking to people are going to be the people who are giving the information for people to carry forward.
It's interesting that you mentioned Rupert Sheldrake. A few years ago, when Fortune Times was, I don't know, was it 200 or 300 time and issue, and they asked some of us who regularly contributed or were famous and that, not me, about what was the best fortune thing that they'd ever come across, and I'm proud to say that I was next after Neil Gaiman in the alphabet there. And I actually quoted Rupert Sheldrake, because when I first started reading Fortune Times years ago, like the best part of 40 years ago, issue, I don't know, 35, something like that, it was in the 30s. One of the things was written by, or an interview with Rupert Sheldrake, and where he was, you know, openly branded as being a heretic by all the usual suspects. And he came up with this concept a bit, which really, I say blew my mind, that's a bit over the top, but really made me start to think a bit more laterally rather than, and that was, he said, maybe the you, the me, whoever it is, each person isn't actually situated here. They're somewhere else, which is maybe possibly when you're dreaming. It's a bit like getting in a car. You get in the car and you drive somewhere and you do all that, and then you get out. Maybe your body and your brain and all that is the equivalent of the car. I'm probably misquoting you, I'm saying that. And that therefore, what happens to you, you aren't here, you're somewhere else. And therefore, maybe if you come to the question of people who've had transplants, maybe if that is the case, maybe the heart that's been put in is somehow still connected to the donor out there, just as the main of the body is to the real person. I mean, if you've got somebody, if we get to the science fiction stage of transplanting brains, the question would be, is it the recipient being of somebody else's brain, or is the brain receiving the recipient of somebody else's body? And we don't know. I mean, that's one of those conundrums that you can chat about over a pint, but there isn't really an answer. But it's an intriguing thought. Well, for me,
it is indeed, and it's one of these that people need to think more deeply about these issues, because as medical science progresses, the concept of brain transplants becomes more realistic and more real, or even more amazing. The idea of with AI at the moment, the way AI consciousness and everything else as well. We've got some very interesting moral dilemmas to take into account here. And of course, as well, just I think your point was a very, very interesting one about the way in which the heart might still be in some way attached to the other person. And I think the solution to this could be that we misunderstand the nature of time. And if we understand the nature of time, we assume that time is chronological and it's sequential, and the past becomes the present, the future becomes we're in the past and we move into the present, into the future. But there could be an argument to say that time could also be orthogonal in the sense that it's running at a right angle to time. Right. And in which case there is this kind of time going in a different angle, in which case everything is happening at the same moment. So all things, past, present, and future, are all elements of the same thing, in which case then, that heart is still in some way and a deeper level already attached. And of course, we know from quantum mechanics, we know about the ideas of the way of non-locality, we know of superposition, we know that there seems to be instantaneous communication between subatomic particles, suggesting that at a deeper level of reality, everything is a oneness, everything is a whole, or holographic, and therefore we are seeing things using our perceptions, and our perceptions in some ways are probably wrong in many ways. But we should say, right, finally, we're getting near the end. So
I just thought, I've got a couple of cases of transplants, which I'll quickly read out, because they amuse me, and I hope they will amuse your audience. Jane Lindley, 55, this is 1999. Jane Lindley, 55, from Retford, Nottinghamshire, had a liver transplant in 1999 after developing hepatitis C, and was suddenly a football fan. Her donor was a young married man from West Yorkshire. When football used to come on the television, it would be turned off, or Jane would disappear and read a book elsewhere, said her husband Cyril, a lifelong supporter of Leeds United. Now she's as big a fan as I am, even to the point where she's putting on teletext to catch up with the latest results. Said Jane, it's all very strange. I'm finding I'm thinking about Leeds United more and more. I know all the players' names and understand the game. It's just great. And the other one, slightly different. A lumberjack claimed he started enjoying housework after he was given a female kidney and sued his health authority. Stefan Lisic, apologies for my mispronunciation of Croatian names, 56, from East Croatian town of Osijek, said he had become a laughingstock because he no longer wanted to go drinking with friends. The transplant saved my life, he said, but I wasn't warned about the side effects. I've developed a strange passion for ironing, sewing, washing dishes, sorting clothes in wardrobes, and even knitting. His wife, Ludmilla, added, if it's just housework, I'm happy. I only hope he doesn't start looking at other men.
Wow, that is priceless. I think that is the perfect ending to a fascinating discussion, Rob. If anybody wants to contact you, or do you have a website or anything, or any ways?
No. I'm a social media phobe.
Okay.
I mean, if people have stories or whatever, then yeah, please email me. rob.gandy@ntlworld.com.
Wonderful, because I am sure
that's Gandy, nothing to do with the Indian branch.
Right, because I'm sure there are an awful lot of people watching this live now and watching it later in the recording will be very keen to contact you, because clearly your work is incredibly important and absolutely fascinating.
I wouldn't go that far.
Oh, it is. It's so important. You're chronicling people's experiences, stuff that is normally not recorded. You are a latter-day Tom Sleeman, and I was going to ask you.
Oh, no. I am not. Tom, I don't know if you. I don't want to run out of time, but I went into Aintree Hospital where I was doing some work, and one of the guy who sorted my accounts said, "Oh, who's been seeing ghosts?" And I said, "Oh, no, I don't know. Who has?" He said, "You." I said, "No, I've never seen a ghost." And he said, "Yes, you have. It's in Haunted Liverpool too, by Tom Sleeman." And I said, "What?" So I dug out the Haunted Liverpool 2, which I have on my bookshelf, and it was a story that of a genuine, well, probably the only genuine experience that ever happened to me. Do you want to hear it?
Go on quickly. I'm sure everybody can stay for a few more minutes.
I was driving from Walton Hospital down through Kirkdale, which is North Liverpool, not far from the Everton football ground, towards the centre of Liverpool, on my way home from working in South Sefton. And when I pulled up at the traffic lights in the middle of Kirkdale, you know what it's like. It's late afternoon and there's a few cars and there's a van in front of me. I was about the fourth car back, and people will not go and, with their shopping, go down to the traffic lights and cross as properly they should. They'll cut in between the cars. And there was this woman at the side on the curb who had like bright blouse, dyed hair. I would describe her as mutton dressed as lamb, if it was an old phrase, or that, with her bags. And she stepped off between the front of my car and the van in front, looked up and down the road, and then waddled over to the other side. And when you're the driver sat there, you sort of just watch them. Oh, yeah. Why didn't you go to the traffic lights? And then the traffic lights changed, and we set off, and we drove down to where Notre Dame College is, over the brow and down to the junction with Great Howard Street. Traffic lights, they were on red, so I pulled up. Now this is about 3/4 of a mile, and I stopped. To my left, there was this woman who got like dyed bright hair, a loud blouse, carrying shopping, and stepped between me and the car in front and waddled over to the central reservation. It was the same woman. I mean, I cannot explain it. I'm there watching her with my jaw dropped. And as the lights changed, we set off, I was looking in my wing mirror and she was still there. Now, not spooky in the slightest. Can I explain it? No. It's the only really bizarre thing that's ever happened to me. But Tom Sleeman, I wrote that up, put it in 14 times. Tom Sleeman quoted it. So, yeah.
Perfect. I think that's a perfect ending story. And what we will do is we'll have you back for Incon and spend more time with
it's not tin ends after it, is it? Incon.
Is get Incon what?
Tin ends.
Oh, yes, that just reminds me, actually. I used to live in Colchester in Essex, and on Colchester Station, there was a big sign, and it said Harwich for the continent, and somebody had put next door Frinton on Sea for the incontinent, because Frinton is a famous place for elderly people.
Yeah,
it just always amused me. But it's been a delight chatting to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And we'll have you back on, and really it's just an honor to chat to you, and thank you very much. And just for everybody else, just to let everybody know, the next show will be on Monday the 12th of June, when I've got two previous guests on the show who will be joining us again. One will be Dr. Alan Roberts, and also Jake Murray. We'll be discussing Shakespeare and the mystical, because Jake is doing a big event in Durham of a series of mystical plays of Shakespeare, Macbeth, I think it is, The Tempest, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. And of course, Dr. Alan Roberts is recognized as being one of the world's leading experts on A Midsummer Night's Dream. So that's going to be a fascinating conversation and discussion on matters of literature and literary, if everybody's interested. Okay, and thanks again for my wonderful guest, Dr. Rob Gandy. It's been absolutely wonderful chatting to you. And as I say, it's very sad that we lived within 500 yards of each other and never met. which is incredible.
Not even the three stags could get us together.
Not even the three stags. There's one of my friends, actually, Noreen Hill, who lives on Bromrapool, is listening in as well, so she'll really get the three stags reference as well. So wonderful. Okay, take care.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Okay, thank you. And everybody else, thanks for everybody for listening. Thank you.